No one expected that the last words Michael Jackson ever spoke to his brother would not be a warm goodbye, but a quiet warning. A sentence so gentle it barely disturbed the air in his family home, yet heavy enough to explain why the king of pop would leave this world in a way that stunned millions. This was never just a random accident. It was not only a matter of personal mistakes. What really happened to Michael Jackson was the result of pressure layered over years' fatigue that became invisible, and a man pushed to his absolute limit while insisting he was fine. When Michael stepped away from the stage, the world never saw him clearly. To some, he was anticipation and nostalgia. To others, suspicion and controversy. Love and caution wrapped around the same person. That contradiction followed him to the very end. And on his final evening, in a quiet room with a piano, instead of a crowd, that divide was sharper than ever. On the surface, Michael looked okay. He laughed with his kids, teased his brother, moved the way he always had in family settings. But if you watched closely, if you really knew him, something was off. The way he sat at the piano, shoulders slightly hunched. The way his eyes drifted, not quite locking onto anyone for long. The way his body seemed present, but his spirit felt a step behind. This was the man who could stand unshaken in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans. Yet here in his own space, surrounded by the people who loved him most, he radiated a fragile calm that didn't match the legend the world thought they knew. Jermaine Jackson was not easy to rattle. He'd walked with Michael from their cramped house in Gary, Indiana, to sold-out arenas, watched his younger brother become the center of global pop culture, and survive storms that would have ended most careers. But that night Jermaine felt a kind of unease he couldn't explain. Michael sat at the piano, not as a performer, but as a man trying to breathe. His playing was slow, almost hesitant. Soft melodies floated just loud enough for the family to hear, never rising to showmanship. The children giggled in the background, adults spoke in low voices, and in the middle of it all, Michael seemed to be slowly stepping inward. He was still the center of the room, but it felt like he was standing just outside the circle at the same time. Then, without ceremony, he looked up and said it. "I just want to give them the best of me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a speech. The words just slipped out almost like an afterthought. But Jermaine stopped. There was a weight in that simple line, an exhaustion that doesn't come from one hard week, but from a lifetime of being required to be perfect. It sounded like something a man says when he has already given more than he should and still believes it's not enough. Michael didn't say the world or the fans. He chose a smaller, softer word, them. In that one syllable, everyone in the room could hear something different. For Jermaine, them meant the children running around the living room, the crowds who still expected miracles from a tired body, and a society that had learned to treat Michael Jackson less like a person and more like a symbol. As a black artist who had kicked down doors the industry never intended to open for someone like him, Michael knew better than anyone what it meant to be dissected, doubted and measured against impossible standards. He rarely complained out loud, but that reality was stamped into how he moved, how he worked, how he kept going when most people would have stopped. And that night he did not talk about pain. He didn't rant about pressure or injustice. He didn't ask for a break. That silence was exactly what made Jermaine uneasy. Because the ones who carry the heaviest loads are often not the ones who shout the loudest. They are the ones who keep smiling, keep joking, keep playing soft melodies, while everything inside them is fraying. Jermaine remembers one detail that almost no one else noticed. At one point, Michael's fingers paused on the keys a little too long. Just a few seconds, but enough for Jermaine to see that his brother's hands were trembling just slightly. Michael quickly masked it with a familiar move. He smiled, turned toward one of his kids, made a light joke, and the moment evaporated. That had always been his way: cover exhaustion with tenderness, wrap pressure and music, make concern disappear behind a joke before anyone can name it. Jermaine saw it. And the thing that would haunt him later was not that he missed the sign, it was that he saw it and stayed quiet. In the Jackson family, Michael had always been the one who carried the most weight. The one expected to hold it together, the one who wasn't allowed to be weak for long. Even when he was the biggest star on the planet, he still felt like he had something to prove. That evening, talk naturally drifted to the future. To this, is it the massive concert series that was meant to be Michael's triumphant return? He spoke about it with a strange mix of excitement and fatigue. To the family, it sounded like another project, another challenge he'd overcome. To Michael, it sounded more like a final offering. He described the shows as a gift he wanted to give his audience, something that would make everything right again. No one argued. They were used to Michael putting everyone else first. But if you listened between the words, there was a quiet urgency there, as if he knew the clock was running faster than anyone wanted to admit. Later, someone close would recall seeing Michael and Jermaine step out to a balcony, the wind moving gently, city lights scattered below them. Michael's voice dropped lower as he spoke privately. "I just want to make this right," he supposedly said. There is no recording of that moment. No hard proof. Only second-hand memory. But if that line is accurate, it adds another layer to the picture. Michael wasn't charging into the future with unshakable confidence. He was moving forward, carrying a need to fix, to complete, to redeem one more time. To the world, Michael Jackson was destiny fulfilled, the chosen one, the barrier breaker, the black artist who rose from nothing to become the face of pop. But very few stopped to ask about the price of that climb. The industry he entered was never gentle. The scrutiny was harsher for someone like him. The expectations were heavier. Mistakes were magnified. So he learned to smile when treated unfairly. He learned to stay quiet when his image was twisted. He learned that he was not allowed to be tired, not in public. That last night, he didn't list those wounds, but they leaked out in the details. In the way he played more slowly than usual. In the way his gaze lingered on his children, as if memorizing them. In the way he said "the best of me," as though that best was something he had been pouring out for so long there might not be much left. When the evening finally wound down, nothing dramatic happened. No one hugged Michael unusually tight. No one asked an extra question. The room dissolved like any other family gathering. As Jermaine walked away, he turned once more. Michael was still by the piano, bathed in soft gold light. His face looked thinner than Jermaine wanted to admit. His body looked smaller than the legend the world imagined. That ordinary image became a permanent scar, precisely because it looked so normal, quiet, harmless. Hours later, the world would tilt. But in that moment, Michael Jackson was just a man at a piano, holding a lifetime of pressure in a single soft sentence. "I just want to give them the best of me." No one realized it yet, but that simple line was not just a thought. It was a warning spoken so gently that everyone in the room mistook it for peace. And that's where the tragedy truly began. Not with a sudden catastrophe, but with a deceptively calm night, and a man who had given so much of himself that there was almost nothing left. The morning arrived too quickly, cutting through the fragile calm of that family night like a knife. Jermaine Jackson had barely shaken off the soft glow of the previous evening when the phone rang. It wasn't a desperate ring. It wasn't frantic. It sounded almost normal, and that more than anything made his stomach tighten. When he picked up, he didn't hear a full sentence. Just broken pieces crashing into each other. "Michael Hospital Emergency." The voice on the other end wasn't shouting. It wasn't sobbing. It was trembling. And in that trembling, Jermaine understood something with a kind of cold, immediate clarity. Something was terribly wrong. Just hours earlier, his brother had been at the piano speaking softly about the future, about what he still wanted to give. Now the world had switched tones without warning. No transition, no time to prepare, no chance to catch his breath. Jermaine shot to his feet. The questions in his head never fully formed into words. He didn't ask for details. He didn't ask for explanations. There was only one instinct left: get to the hospital. On the way there, the city suddenly felt cruelly slow. Traffic lights held red longer than they should. Cars ahead crawled oblivious. Inside the vehicle, time ran faster than any clock could measure. Images from the night before replayed on a loop. Michael's hands hovering over the keys. the small tremor he'd tried to hide, that gentle voice saying, "I just want to give them the best of me." Now those words didn't sound like a simple wish. They echoed like a warning he had never recognized. What unnerved Jermaine most wasn't even the fear that Michael might be gone. It was the confusion, the information arriving in fragments. One person said Michael was just exhausted. Another hinted that the situation isn't good. Others spoke in half sentences as if saying too much out loud might make it more real. Outside, the world was already moving faster than the family. Rumors began to leak. News outlets started whispering before Jermaine could even reach the hospital doors. When you carry a name like Michael Jackson, even the most fragile moment doesn't stay private for long. Public curiosity always seems to arrive before the truth. Walking into the hospital, Jermaine was struck by how quiet it was. No cinematic chaos, no shouting, just sterile white walls, the echo of footsteps, the low murmur of staff. The orderliness unnerved him more than any shouting could have. He scanned faces, searching for someone who would tell him what he needed to hear, that everything was under control, that Michael was being treated, that there was still time. No one said that. He asked the only question that mattered, "Is he okay?" No one answered him directly. Eyes flickered away. Words spiraled around the point. That evasiveness was the first thing that made the family question not just what had happened to Michael, but how it was being handled. Time in the hallway didn't flow, it pressed down. Every minute felt heavier than the last. Jermaine leaned against a wall, closing his eyes, but the images didn't stop. He remembered how Michael had looked at his children, how he always spoke about responsibility more than joy, how his life had been a long list of people he felt he had to protect. Michael had never really lived for himself. He was a black man who had climbed from poverty to the top of an industry that wasn't designed for him, and yet even at the top he was never allowed the simple luxury of falling apart. The expectations on his shoulders came from everywhere: the fans, the media, the business, the culture. A world ready to worship him when he was flawless, and just as ready to tear him apart when he wasn't. Someone who was there later said Jermaine kept checking his phone, as if hoping for one more detail that would somehow make all of this make sense. But each new call only added to the blur. Contradictions, half answers, no clear picture. That lack of clarity would later feed questions about what really happened, about what was missed, what was overlooked, and who, if anyone, should have done more. But in that moment, Jermaine wasn't thinking about blame or investigations. He was thinking about one thing: his brother was somewhere behind a door he couldn't walk through. When that door finally closed again, when they told him he could go in, it felt like a line being drawn across his life. Before a brother who always believed Michael could survive anything. After a man forced to accept that no one can carry that much weight forever. Jermaine stepped through slower than usual, as if his body knew what his mind refused to accept. Michael lay there. Not the Michael of the stage, not the tireless performer rehearsing until dawn, but a small, very still Michael. The body that had once held the rhythm of an entire generation now lay so quiet that the air around him felt frozen. Jermaine didn't cry immediately. People around him would later be surprised by that. Even he couldn't fully explain it. His mind hadn't caught up to his heart yet. This was a moment too big for any instinct to process in real time. He moved closer, searching for any sign: a twitch, a breath, a crease of the brow. Something to prove this was all a mistake. There was nothing. When he finally reached out and touched Michael's hand, the sensation stopped him cold. Later, when he described it, his voice dropped. "I touched his hand," he said. "It was so cold. That cold wasn't superficial. It didn't just sit on the skin. It ran straight up through Jermaine's arm and into his chest, knocking the air out of him." In that instant, all the titles disappeared. There was no king of pop, no icon. Just two brothers and a loss no one could reverse. He held Michael's hand longer than necessary, as if letting go would make the moment official, as if release meant admission that his brother was truly gone. In his mind, one sentence replayed louder now than it had sounded the night before. I just want to give them the best of me. It no longer sounded like generosity. It sounded like confession. It was the truth of a man who had crossed his own limits, long ago, still trying to pour from an empty well. A warning hidden inside a beautiful phrase. People began drifting into the room, relatives' familiar faces, trembling hands pressed to faces, trying not to break. But Jermaine barely registered them. For him, the world had shrunk to one bed, one hand, one voice that would never speak again. Someone would later say they heard Jermaine whisper something so softly that no one could quite make out the words. The room felt too heavy to carry sound. It looked like an apology. An apology for not stopping him, for believing Michael would always be okay, for letting his brother carry a weight that should have been shared. What haunted Jermaine most wasn't just the still body in front of him, but the realization that the signs had been there, scattered across nights, tours, rehearsals, interviews, and no one had put them together in time. The endless rehearsals, the constant flights, the pressure to reclaim the top spot in a world ready to scrutinize every step of a black man who had once been untouchable. Michael had spent years in a state of constant proving he still had it, proving he wasn't the caricature others tried to turn him into, proving that the crown still fit, even when it weighed more than he could bear. In that drive to prove, somewhere along the line, he stopped protecting himself. Or maybe he never believed he had the right to. The minutes that followed inside that hospital room blurred together, procedures, explanations, formalities delivered in flat tones. None of it mattered. The only thing that stayed sharp was the feeling of his hand slipping away from Michael's. When he finally let go, it felt like releasing part of his own life. Michael wasn't just his little brother. He was the kid who stood next to him in front of a microphone when no one thought they would escape that house in Gary. The one who faced stares and prejudice at his side. The one whose voice had carved a path where there had been no road at all for artists who looked like them. When Jermaine stepped back out into the corridor, the outside world was already in a frenzy. Phones buzzed. News alerts flashed. Cameras were forming into lines outside. But inside his mind, everything was stuck on one frozen image, a cold hand. He knew that from this moment on, Michael's story would no longer belong solely to the family. It would become evidence, arguments, headlines. People would search for causes, assign blame, pick apart every decision. For Jermaine, the cause could not be explained by one single event. It lived in the long process, the years of expectation, judgment, and isolation that had worn his brother down piece by piece. Standing there in that hallway, he finally understood what those last words really meant. Michael didn't just want to give the best. He was telling them he had almost nothing left. The warning hadn't come as a breakdown or a plea for help. It had come wrapped in humility, in a sentence that sounded positive, selfless, almost inspirational. By the time anyone realized it was a cry from the edge, it was already too late. After that day, time never felt the same for Jermaine. It didn't flow, it dripped. Every second felt too loud and too quiet at once. He watched the world keep turning. The sun still rose. Traffic still moved. People still laughed outside hospital walls. The universe doesn't pause for one family's grief, not even when that family is the Jacksons. Later, when Jermaine replayed that last evening in his head, certain small details refused to fade. The way Michael stood up from the piano, slower than usual, using the instrument for balance for a split second. No one commented. Everyone thought he's just tired. That was the most terrifying part, how normal his exhaustion looked. Because when being worn out becomes acceptable, when being pushed to the limit is treated as routine, the danger line disappears. There were other details. Michael barely touched his food that night. He talked, he played, he listened carefully, but his plate stayed almost full. No one pressed him. Skipping meals had become part of his rhythm. Work first. Music first. Responsibility first. The body always last. When someone treats themselves like a tool for too long, the damage doesn't announce itself with one dramatic moment. It creeps in quietly. Jermaine remembered how Michael's eyes stayed on his children a little longer than normal, as if trying to memorize their faces. He offered them small, practical instructions: eat properly, listen to the adults, love each other. On the surface, it sounded like any father's reminders. Afterward, those words felt like a careful attempt to arrange the world, just in case he wasn't there to manage it. Maybe Michael didn't know what would happen, but somewhere in him, he may have felt how thin the line had become. The tragedy of this story doesn't live in one explosive moment. It lives in the series of quiet signals that everyone mistook for just how he is. He didn't say, "I'm not okay." He said, "I want to give them the best." Between those two sentences lies a distance that no one bridged in time. Over the years, people would argue over documents' testimony timelines. They'd dissect medical files and reconstruct the final hours. But whenever Jermaine tried to understand the truth, his mind always went back to that evening, to the tiny things. A trembling hand, a distant gaze, a man who had stopped taking care of himself, and a single gentle sentence that carried a lifetime of pressure. Michael Jackson did not vanish in a single instant. He was worn down in silence. Not because no one loved him, but because he had been loved in a way that left no room for him to be weak. In the end, those last words to his brother were not a farewell. They were a warning. Not about a plot, not about a single night, but about what happens when a human being spends too long trying to be more than human. A warning spoken so softly that the world didn't hear it until after he was gone. If you know someone whose life or personality mirrors this story, share their name in the comments.